There is one strange and almost unnoticed thing. Most people sincerely consider themselves free while living a life that is almost entirely made up of automatic reactions, other people's expectations, unconscious fears, old resentments, inherited attitudes, and decisions that they never truly chose, but which for some reason they continue to consider themselves. Not noticing that a significant part of their so-called personality was formed not as the result of conscious choice, but as a set of survival strategies learned a very long time ago. A person says that they are doing what they want, but if you look more closely, it becomes clear that very often they are simply doing what is expected of them. What is safe? What does not destroy their familiar image? What allows them to remain within the boundaries of approval and not face inner anxiety? And it is precisely this that they call freedom, while Jung called this state a life governed by the unconscious. Because, according to Jung, as long as a person does not realize which inner forces, complexes, fears, and repressed desires are directing their decisions, they do not live in the true sense of the word, but merely act out a script that was not written by them, but was embedded in their psyche so long ago that they perceive it as their own nature. And the strangest thing here is that from the inside, this lack of freedom is almost not felt as a lack of freedom, because it seems to a person that they are choosing, deciding, acting, and shaping their life, although in reality they again and again find themselves drawn to the same types of people, to the same situations, to the same conflicts, and to the same emotional dead ends, which they tend to call fate, character, or simply the way it turned out. Jung called this compulsive repetition, the unconscious urge to return to the same inner knots where something once remained unlived, unreflected, and unintegrated. And that is why even radical external changes, such as changing a country, a profession, a partner, or a lifestyle, so often do not change the most important thing, because a person simply renounces the same inner script into new scenery. And here the first truly disturbing thought appears, which is that as long as you do not realize what exactly lives inside you and determines your reactions, choices, and attractions, you are not a free being, but merely follow forces that you do not see, and that precisely because of this have almost absolute power over you. Jung formulated this with extreme harshness when he said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And if you think about it, almost his entire view of the human psyche is contained in this phrase, because it means that a huge part of what a person is used to considering their character, their tastes, their decisions, and even their values may turn out to be not the result of free inner choice, but merely the automatic work of psychic mechanisms that once helped them survive and since then have simply continued to reproduce the same pattern. A person may think that they are choosing people, but very often they are in fact choosing a familiar feeling, a familiar pain, or a familiar type of emotional tension, just in a new form. They may think that they are choosing a path, but in reality they are often merely systematically avoiding what frightens them, and they may be convinced that they are just like this, without noticing that a significant part of this just like this is not essence, but defense. And here a question arises that sounds much more dangerous than it may seem at first glance, because it forces you to doubt the very foundation of your sense of self. How much in your life is actually yours, not in the socially approved sense, not in the habitual sense, and not in the convenient sense, but in the sense of something that was truly chosen from within, after an honest look at what is driving you. Jung did not understand freedom as the ability to do whatever you want, because he saw too well that a person who does not know themselves almost always turns out to be a slave to their own inner automatisms, and therefore he spoke of freedom as the result of long painful and often unpleasant work of meeting those parts of yourself that you would prefer not to see, not to acknowledge, and not to consider yourself. And perhaps the most important thing here is that a person much more often fears not external limitations, but the inner truth about themselves, because this truth almost always destroys the comfortable and familiar image in which they are used to living, and that is why it is easier for them not to know than to know, not to see than to see, and not to be aware than to be aware. And as long as they do not know, they are not free, because they are ruled precisely by what they do not admit in themselves. And it is exactly from this point, from this boundary between the illusion of freedom and the beginning of real self-knowledge, that the conversation begins, which Jung called a meeting with the shadow. We are approaching the place where Jung made perhaps his most disturbing and most radical move when he stated that inside each of us there exists not just a region of the unconscious, but an entire layer of personality that we not only do not know but actively do not want to know, because it is precisely there that those qualities, impulses, desires, and drives are located that do not fit into our image of a normal, good, or acceptable person. Jung called this the shadow, and by this word he did not mean something mystical or pathological, but everything in us that was once rejected, repressed, or suppressed. Because at some point in life we understood that with these parts of us we are not loved, not accepted, or not approved of, and therefore it was much safer to pretend that they did not exist than to risk losing belonging, love, or a sense of safety. Thus, inside a person, an image of I is gradually formed that seems to them to be their true self. And next to it there appears a vast territory of everything that they should not be and that they believe they are not. Although in reality it is precisely there that aggression, envy, thirst for power, the need to dominate, the desire to be significant at any cost, resentment, jealousy, egoism, and many other impulses are sent. Impulses that do not disappear just because we do not want to see them, but instead begin to live their own, hidden, and therefore much more dangerous life. The problem that Jung pointed out again and again is that everything that is not made conscious does not become weaker, but on the contrary acquires autonomy. And the more strongly a person is convinced that they are not like that this is not in them, that they are above this, the greater the probability that these repressed parts will control their decisions from the shadows, manifesting themselves in the form of uncontrollable emotional outbursts, strange attractions, irrational antipathies, recurring conflicts, and actions that they themselves later cannot explain. That is why Jung said that a person does not become light by refusing to see their darkness, because in that case the darkness simply becomes unconscious and therefore uncontrollable. And it is precisely such darkness, in his view, that is the most dangerous factor both in the individual psyche and in collective history. The more a person identifies themselves exclusively with the image of being good, proper, or moral, the more they are forced to repress everything that does not fit into this image. And the more this repressed energy begins to look for an outlet in distorted forms, turning either into hidden aggression, or into moral superiority, or into the desire to judge and punish others for what they themselves do not allow themselves to acknowledge within. Jung saw in this one of the deepest paradoxes of the human psyche, because a person who is most convinced of their own rightness very often turns out to be the one who is least aware of their own cruelty, their own thirst for power, or their own capacity for destruction, and that is precisely why they tend to project all of this onto others, sincerely believing that evil is out there and not in here. Projection is another of those mechanisms that make a person unfree, because instead of meeting their own shadow, they begin to see it everywhere around them, in other people, in groups, in ideologies, in the bad and the wrong, without noticing that in reality they are not fighting the world, but those parts of themselves that they could not bear and from which they tried to get rid within. And the more fiercely they fight them outside, the fewer chances they have of ever attaining inner wholeness, because a war with one's own shadow, projected into the external world, can never be won. It can only be endlessly reproduced in new forms, new enemies, and new conflicts. Jung argued that a person becomes truly dangerous not when they are aware of their capacity for evil, but when they are sincerely convinced that they do not have such a capacity, because it is precisely in that case that they lose all inner vigilance and any possibility of controlling what in fact continues to live within them. And here we come to another extremely unpleasant thought, which is that a large part of what a person calls their morality is very often not the result of conscious integration of their dark sides, but simply the result of their repression, and such morality, according to Jung, always remains fragile, because it is based not on the strength of conscious choice, but on fear of one's own impulses. That is why Jung said that the task of personal development is not to become good in the naive sense of this word, but to become whole, that is capable of acknowledging within oneself those forces that we would prefer not to see and learning to live with them consciously rather than under their hidden control. Because as long as a person does not know what they are capable of, they are not a moral being. They are merely a being limited by their own blindness. And as long as they have not met their shadow, they are not free, even if it seems to them that they live correctly and consciously. And perhaps the most difficult thing here is that a meeting with the shadow almost never looks like something heroic or elevated, because much more often it begins with a very quiet and very unpleasant realization that those qualities we condemn most in others, those reactions that irritate us most, and those forms of behavior that we consider alien or unacceptable have far more to do with us than we would like to admit. And it is precisely from this moment, from the moment when a person stops automatically projecting their inner evil outward and begins to ask what role it plays in their own psyche, that the process begins which Jung called individuation, that is, a slow, difficult, and often painful movement toward true inner wholeness, without which, in his conviction, no real freedom is possible. We are approaching what Jung considered not merely a psychological process, but the central meaning of human development, namely individuation, that is, the slow and often painful path on which a person stops being a set of defenses, roles, and adaptations and gradually begins to become who they are in a deeper and more whole sense. Jung saw individuation not as a path to happiness, success, or inner comfort, but as a path to wholeness, and that is precisely why he believed that most people, even very intelligent and educated ones, never truly walk this path. Because it requires giving up too many illusions, too many convenient self-deceptions, and too many habitual ways of explaining to oneself why everything is fine with me. It is here that it becomes clear that freedom in the Jungian sense is not a state in which a person can do whatever they want, but a state in which they are no longer in blind submission to their complexes, their repressed fears, and their unconscious impulses, because they have at least begun to see them, begun to take them into account, and begun to take responsibility for their influence on their life. This process almost never looks like something dramatic or inspiring, because much more often it begins with a very quiet, but very unpleasant experience of inner division, when a person suddenly begins to notice that their image of themselves and their real psychic life are not the same thing, and that many of the things they did, believed, and chose were dictated not by what they wanted, but by what they feared or by what they were unconsciously drawn toward. It is at this moment that a person begins to gradually lose that comfortable certainty that they know who they are, and instead there appears a much more disturbing, but also much more honest feeling that they are in a process of becoming rather than in a state of completion, and that a significant part of their life up to this point has, in essence, been lived on autopilot. Jung believed that individuation inevitably includes not only an encounter with the shadow, but also a revision of those values, identities, and life goals that a person previously accepted as something self-evident. And that is precisely why this path is often accompanied by crises, by the loss of orientation, and by the feeling that the old life no longer works while the new one has not yet taken shape. Freedom here does not come as relief, because to see more also means to carry more, and when a person begins to become aware of their own dark, contradictory, and not always pleasant sides, they can no longer, with the same former naivety, blame the world, fate, or other people for what is happening in their life. And it is precisely this awareness of responsibility for one's own psychic reality that becomes, perhaps, the heaviest and the most adult step on this path. And yet Jung was convinced that without this step a person remains an internally divided being, who either lives in illusions about themselves or is in a constant war with what does not fit into these illusions, and in both cases remains unfree, because their life is governed not by a whole self, but by a conflict between who they want to consider themselves to be and who they actually are. Individuation does not mean that a person becomes better in a moral or social sense, because Jung understood too well that wholeness includes both light and darkness, both strength and weakness, both creative and destructive impulses. But it does mean that a person stops being naive about themselves and stops automatically replaying the same inner dramas without understanding why they are repeated again and again. And perhaps the most important thing here is that as this process unfolds, a person begins to gradually free themselves not from external limitations, but from the inner necessity to constantly pretend to be someone else, to conform to an image, or to maintain an identity that once helped them survive, but has long since stopped reflecting the reality of their inner life. Jung saw in this not merely psychological development, but a kind of ethical task, because a person who knows what they are capable of and who has seen their own dark sides becomes much less inclined toward moralizing, toward projection, and toward the desire to fix others, while failing to notice that they are fighting first of all with themselves. And that is why, paradoxical as it may sound, the path to genuine freedom in Jung does not pass through strengthening the sense of one's own rightness or one's own goodness, but through a much more modest and much more difficult state of inner honesty, in which a person no longer needs to be perfect, but also can no longer allow themselves to be unconscious. And if one tries to formulate this very simply, one could say that freedom in the Jungian sense begins at the moment when a person stops asking how to become happy or successful and begins to ask what in them wants to be seen, acknowledged, and integrated, even if this does not coincide with their habitual image of themselves. Because only in this case does their life stop being a reaction and begin, slowly and uncertainly, to become a choice.